Today, we're going to be talking about one of the oldest and most important stories in the world, Homer's Iliad. It's a huge epic poem about a great war, incredible heroes, and what it really means to be human. And believe it or not, the whole thing starts with just one single feeling. This is the very first word of the entire poem, menace. It's a Greek word that means rage or wrath. But we're not talking about just being a little angry. This is a huge, destructive kind of rage. It belongs to the story's greatest hero, Achilles, and this one feeling is what powers the whole story.
Now, you might think a story about the 10-year Trojan War would cover, well, all 10 years, but it doesn't. The Iliad actually zooms in on a very short and intense window of time, just 52 days during the final year of the war. It's like a close-up look at a war that's about to boil over.
So, let's dive into our first section and take a closer look at this ancient song of rage.
The poem is absolutely massive.
Look at that number, 15,693. That's how many lines it has. And every single one of them, in some way, is about the consequences of Achilles' anger, how it affects his friends, his enemies, and even the gods themselves. So we have this incredible story, but for hundreds of years, people wondered if the city at the heart of it all was even real. That brings us to our next part, searching for the real Troy.
For a very, very long time, most people believed that the city of Troy was just a myth. You know, a make-believe place for a legendary story. But a couple hundred years ago, all of that began to change.
Archaeologists started digging at a big hill in the country of Turkey, and what they found was amazing. It wasn't just one city, it was 9 cities, built one right on top of the other like a giant layer cake of history. They were digging through thousands of years. And one of those layers, which they call Troy 7a, really stood out. The dates for this layer matched up perfectly with when the Trojan War was supposed to have happened. And even more telling, this layer showed clear signs that it was destroyed by fire and by war. It was a huge discovery.
And the evidence just keeps getting stronger. They found piles of sling stones that were stored up for a final battle. They found bodies that were left unburied after the city fell. And they've also discovered that Troy was a huge place with a large lower city. Definitely big enough to be the setting of the epic war the poem describes.
Okay, so the city was real, but what about the poem itself? How was a story this huge and detailed created almost 3,000 years ago, way before most people knew how to read or write? This leads us to our next section, poetry made in performance.
The answer is something called the oral formulaic theory. You see, the Iliad wasn't written as a book at first. It was composed and performed out loud, live, by poets known as bards. They didn't memorize all 15,000 lines word for word. Instead, they had a kind of toolkit of phrases they could use to build the poem as they were singing it.
One of their most important tools was the noun epithet. It's a special little nickname that's attached to a person or a thing. These nicknames weren't just for fun. They were designed to fit perfectly into the rhythm of the poem, which helped the poet keep the story flowing smoothly.
And here is the most famous example of all. Achilles is almost never just called Achilles. He's called swift-footed Achilles. That little phrase has a special rhythm that the poet could just slot into a line whenever he needed it. It was a key part of their storytelling toolkit.
And here's where it gets really amazing. Because the poem was passed down by singers for so long, it ended up preserving details of a world that was already ancient by the time the poet Homer lived. It's like a time capsule. A great example is the boar's tusk helmet. The poem describes this helmet in a lot of detail. But here's the thing, in Homer's time, nobody wore these. They were a special kind of armor from hundreds of years earlier, back in the Greek Bronze Age. Homer could never have actually seen one himself.
So that description is like a fossil tucked away inside the poem. The memory of this ancient helmet was passed down from poet to poet for centuries until it finally got written down. It's incredible proof of just how old this story really is.
So now let's turn to the heart of the story itself, the main character, Achilles, and the massive choice he has to make. This section is called A Hero's Tragic Choice.
Achilles knows he has 2 paths in front of him. He can choose Kleos, which means glory. That means he stays and fights at Troy, dies young, but his name will be remembered forever. Or he can choose Nostos, which means homecoming. He could just go home, live a long and happy life, but he'd be forgotten. This is the big conflict of his story.
His journey in the poem really happens in 3 stages. First, his rage makes him quit the war, which is a total disaster for his army. Then, in the second stage, his best friend Patroclus is killed. This fills Achilles with grief and sends him back to the battle, but now he's fighting for revenge. And finally, at the end of the poem, he finds his humanity again when he and his enemy, King Priam, cry together over all the people they've lost.
So, why do we still care about this story almost 3,000 years later? What makes it so special? Let's talk about our final section, the legacy of the Iliad.
The Iliad is still with us because it talks about things that are always true. For the ancient Greeks, it was like their most important book. For us today, it's a story that explores big ideas like honor, sadness, and life itself. It gives us a very real look at the costs of war, but it also shows that even in the worst situations, people can find compassion and understand each other.
And that leaves us with one last big idea to think about. After all the battles and all the losses, it makes you wonder if the story is really about individual heroes like Achilles. Or maybe the true main character is the powerful and tragic force of war itself, which shapes the lives of everyone it touches.